So, Abraham Maslow. The name probably rings a bell, right? And you definitely know his famous hierarchy of needs. You know, that pyramid? But what if I told you that pyramid is just the tip of the iceberg? That it's really the end result of a much deeper, much more radical philosophy about what science should even be.
Yeah, that's what we're going to dig into here. We're going way beyond the pyramid to really get at the revolutionary argument Maslow was trying to make. Because see, it wasn't just about psychology, it was about the very soul of how we search for truth.
And you know, for him, this whole journey, it didn't start with some abstract theory. It started with people. He had these mentors, Max Wertheimer and Ruth Benedict, and he just deeply admired them. He saw them as these fully realized, self-actualized human beings. And he thought, we need a science that can actually understand people like that. But, okay, to build that new kind of science, he knew he first had to tear down the old one. He took a hard look at the psychology of his day and saw a field that, well, for all its data and all its experiments, it was missing something absolutely fundamental. It was missing a soul.
He actually came up with a name for this problem: desacralization. And what he meant by that was a science that's been stripped of all human feeling. No emotion, no joy, and especially no wonder. It's the kind of science that just observes things from a distance, but never, ever feels a sense of awe. And listen, this wasn't just some academic idea for him. It was personal. It came from this really visceral experience he had. When he was a young man in medical school, he was just horrified watching these surgeons. They were casually tossing removed body parts onto a table. And that cold and calloused attitude, to him it felt like a violation. It became the perfect, chilling example of what he meant by desacralization.
And he saw that exact same coldness in the psychology he was studying. It was an approach that just broke people down into these tiny little bits and pieces. Test scores, reflexes, stimuli. It was all about studying people from the outside, kind of like a mechanic looking at an engine, with almost zero concern for the whole person, for their inner world, their feelings.
But here's the thing about Maslow. He wasn't just a critic. He was a builder. So once he identified the problem, he spent the rest of his life proposing this really radical solution, a new, humanistic vision for what science could be, and frankly, what he thought it should be.
So if the problem was desacralization, what was the solution? Well, for him, it was resacralization. This was his big call to action. He said we needed to intentionally, deliberately put human values, emotion, and even a sense of ritual back into the whole scientific process.
And when you put them side by side, the contrast it's just stark. Orthodox science, its goal was prediction and control. But Maslow's vision aimed for fascination and growth. Traditional science pretended to be value-free. Maslow said, no way, it has to be value-centered. It was a total fundamental shift from just studying parts and pieces to actually trying to understand the whole person. He really put it beautifully himself. He said it's not enough to just study people. A psychologist, he argued, has to approach their subject with real enjoyment, with excitement, wonder, and even affection. The idea is that the observer is always part of the observation. You can't separate them.
Okay, so what does this resacralized science actually look like in practice, right? It's a great idea, but what does it mean? Well, Maslow had a name for this new way of thinking, and he actually borrowed it from Eastern philosophy.
He called it a Taoistic attitude. Now, instead of actively poking and prodding and trying to control whatever you're studying, this approach is all about being non-interfering, passive, and just receptive. The goal isn't to make people more predictable. It's the opposite. It's to release them from control so they can become less predictable and more fully themselves.
So how do you actually do that? It all starts with a passive, receptive stance. Like really listening. From there, you have to let go of that scientific obsession with prediction and control. You just have to relinquish it. And then, the final and maybe the most crucial step, when you come face to face with the mystery of human nature, you don't try to solve it. You just respond with awe.
And this right here, this really gets to the very heart of his whole philosophy. For Maslow, the deepest kind of understanding, it didn't come from analysis, from breaking something down into its parts. It came from being able to just step back and be completely awestruck by the whole thing. Okay, and this leads us to the final piece of the puzzle. And it might just be the most challenging part of Maslow's entire vision. See, it wasn't just about finding a new method. It was about becoming a new kind of scientist. Because this new kind of science, it demanded a new kind of scientist, someone who is actually comfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty, someone willing to trust their own intuition,
someone who cared way more about asking the right questions than about having the most precise answers. And yeah, someone who was brave enough to go after the big, messy, important problems of just being human.
And this led him to a conclusion that honestly turned the entire scientific establishment on its head. He looked around and saw his colleagues obsessed with doing trivial things perfectly. Maslow argued for the complete opposite. He said, "It is so much better to do a clumsy job on something that's profoundly important than it is to perfectly measure something that doesn't matter at all." And he really lived this philosophy himself. He saw his own role as a kind of scout for psychology. He thought his job was to go out ahead into the messy, unknown frontiers of human potential. He was more than happy to just sketch out the map and then leave the really precise technical work of filling in the details to the people who came after him.
Which, of course, brings us to today. We're in an age that's completely dominated by big data, by algorithms, by this constant drive for perfect prediction. And in this world, Maslow's call for a science of awe and wonder, well, it feels more urgent than ever, doesn't it? It leaves us with a really critical question. As we build these incredibly powerful tools to analyze the world, are we remembering to leave any room for fascination, for awe, for those human values that Maslow fought so hard to put right at the very center of our search for truth?